The policeman insists that the disabled woman leave the car, ignoring her explanations. The consequences of his actions will prove unpredictable. Subscribe and write where you are watching this video from. Layla's alarm clock beeped softly, a persistent sound that pulled her out of the remnants of a dream she could no longer remember. Her fingers brushed the sleek surface of her smartphone, silencing the noise with practiced ease, and she lay there for a moment, letting the quiet settle around her. The room was small, cozy even, with its soft golden light filtering through the blinds and casting long shadows across the wooden floor. It was a simple apartment, but it was hers, her space, her sanctuary. She had earned it. She turned onto her side and reached for the prosthetic leg beside her bed, carefully attaching it to her body. Each motion was methodical, almost ritualistic now after years of practice. The process had become second nature. It was a task she had learned to accept as part of her daily routine. The clinking of the metal joints as she snapped the prosthesis in place felt strangely reassuring. She looked at herself in the mirror, her reflection a reminder of everything she had overcome. Layla had lost both of her legs in a car accident almost 5 years ago. The details of that day were blurred in her memory, but she could still recall the strange silence that had followed the crash, how everything seemed to stop except for the blaring horn and the rush of blood. She had been in the passenger seat, the impact tossing her around like a rag doll, and when the world finally settled, she found herself staring at an unfamiliar landscape. But she survived, and that, in itself, had felt like a victory. Now, every morning, she had to remind herself that she wasn't just surviving. She was living. She was thriving. She took a deep breath and pulled herself out of bed, stretching the muscles that had become accustomed to her new way of moving. Her legs, despite being artificial, had become an extension of herself. She no longer felt their foreignness when she stood. Instead, she felt empowered. She dressed quickly, pulling on a dark pair of jeans and a loose sweater. She had learned to dress efficiently, to choose clothes that were comfortable, functional, but still made her feel like herself. Fashion had been the last thing on her mind in the early days after the accident, but now she found herself enjoying the small victories in the way she looked, how she could still feel confident despite the stares. After a quick breakfast of coffee and toast, Layla grabbed her keys, checked that her phone was in her bag, and wheeled herself out the door, locking it behind her. Her car was parked just outside, a modified vehicle with special controls, the seat adjusted for her comfort. Driving was one of the things that had given her independence again. At first, she had been terrified to get back behind the wheel, but now it was just another part of her routine. The streets were quiet as she drove, the early morning sun casting golden rays on the world outside. She found peace in these moments, the hum of the engine, the rhythmic motion of her hands on the wheel. Driving had become her moment of solitude, a time when she could let her mind wander. Sometimes she'd think about the future, about what she wanted to accomplish. Other times she'd think about the past, about the person she used to be. But today was different. Today, she wasn't thinking about her accident or the pain she'd endured. Today, she was thinking about the meeting she was headed to, a coffee date with a couple of friends. It wasn't anything extraordinary, just a small gathering of people she trusted, people who had been with her through the hardest moments. But still, the thought of seeing them made her smile. Layla loved her friends, and they had become her chosen family. They had stood by her when everything had fallen apart, and now they had become her support system, her reason to keep fighting. As she navigated through the streets of the city, She could feel the weight of the world on her shoulders, but it didn't feel as heavy today. Her friends had a way of making her feel lighter, reminding her of the life she had outside of her struggles. They would joke, they would laugh, and for a few hours she could forget about the challenges that came with living in a world that sometimes seemed determined to remind her of her differences. When she pulled into the cafe's parking lot, she felt a wave of excitement rush over her. The cafe was one of her favorite places. Warm, inviting, with the aroma of fresh coffee and pastries filling the air. She wheeled herself inside, greeted by the familiar faces of her friends. They were sitting at their usual spot near the window, their eyes lighting up when they saw her. "Layla!" One of them, Jessica, called out, waving enthusiastically. "You made it!" Layla smiled, rolling herself over to the table. Wouldn't miss it for the world. As she settled into the chair, she felt a sense of ease settle into her chest. She had learned to take these moments for what they were. Simple, fleeting, but valuable. They were reminders that, despite the challenges, she still had joy in her life. And that was enough. They spent the next few hours chatting about everything and nothing, about work, about life, about the small victories that made the struggle worthwhile. Layla listened more than she spoke, soaking in their energy. She wasn't just a passive participant in their conversations, though. She shared her own stories, too, about the small achievements in her life, how she had learned to navigate the world differently, how she had pushed through fear to live the way she wanted to live. The day felt like a warm embrace, and as the afternoon wore on, she realized how much she needed these moments of normalcy. Despite everything, she had found a rhythm. She had learned to move forward, even when it felt like the world was trying to hold her back. But as she wheeled herself back to her car later that afternoon, something caught her eye. A flash of blue and red lights in the rearview mirror. It was a police car following her a little too closely for comfort. Layla's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment she wondered if she had done something wrong, but she quickly dismissed the thought. She hadn't broken any laws. She hadn't been speeding. Still, her nerves tingled with an unfamiliar unease. She pulled over to the side of the road, her palms suddenly clammy. The car stopped behind hers, and the police officer inside began to slowly exit. Layla's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected this. Not today. She glanced at herself in the rearview mirror. She looked fine. She felt fine. But something about the way the officer was walking toward her made her uneasy. She couldn't put her finger on it, but the sense of dread that began to creep in was undeniable. The officer reached her car, his silhouette framed by the harsh glow of the patrol car's lights. She took a steadying breath, and as the officer approached, she rolled down her window. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said, his voice gruff. "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle." Layla's mind raced. The officer's tone was firm, but something in his eyes made her feel uneasy. "I'm afraid I can't get out, officer," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm disabled. I don't have the physical ability to step out of the car." The officer didn't respond immediately. He paused, then stepped closer to her window, leaning down slightly as if to scrutinize her. "I said, step out of the vehicle, ma'am." Layla's heart began to beat faster. Something wasn't right. She knew it. "I can't," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "I really can't. I don't have legs. I can't stand." The officer's face tightened, his gaze turning cold. "You're not above the law, ma'am. I'm asking you to get out of the car." Layla felt a chill run through her. She hadn't expected this. Not today. Not when she was just trying to get home. Something told her that today wasn't going to be ordinary at all. The officer's glare felt like a weight on her chest, suffocating in its intensity. Layla's hands tightened on the steering wheel, her knuckles pale, a subtle tremor started in her fingers. She had always prided herself on being able to handle difficult situations with grace. But this felt different. Wrong. She had been stopped by the police before, plenty of times, but something about the officer's demeanor now made her stomach twist. This wasn't routine. This wasn't just a simple traffic stop. "Ma'am, I'm not asking again," the officer repeated, his voice now sharp and commanding. "Step out of the vehicle." Layla swallowed hard. She was used to confrontation, used to people doubting her abilities or making assumptions based on her appearance. But the force with which he spoke, the lack of empathy in his eyes, it all felt like a trap. Her mind raced for a way out. She could explain again. She could plead, but would it even matter? This officer wasn't looking for understanding. He wasn't listening. "I told you," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I can't step out. I have prosthetics. I can't walk." Her words felt as though they were sinking into a void, her voice sounding hollow in her own ears. The officer didn't respond, only stepped closer to the window, looming over her in a way that made the car feel smaller, tighter. The sounds of the city, the hum of passing cars, the distant chatter of pedestrians, seemed to fade into a strange silence, like the world itself was holding its breath. The officer was now so close she could smell the faint scent of his cologne and see the tension in his jaw, the way his muscles coiled under his uniform. Layla felt her heart hammering in her chest. She could almost hear it over the roar of panic building in her mind. He wasn't letting up. His hand rested casually on his holster, but his stance was aggressive. Too aggressive for someone who should have been following protocol. "Get out of the car now, or I'll have to assist you," he said, his words clipped, his eyes narrowing. Assist her? Layla's pulse quickened. She knew exactly what that meant. He was threatening to use force. She'd been here before, in a sense, not in this exact situation, but in the countless interactions she had experienced with people who assumed she was weak, that she could be controlled easily. But this wasn't just about her disability. This was about something deeper, something more sinister. She could feel it in the officer's body language, in the way his hand hovered near his weapon. He wasn't just mad at her for not following orders. This was something more personal, something more visceral. "Please," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm not resisting you. I can't get out of the car. Just let me show you my ID and registration and we can move on." But the officer wasn't listening. His eyes flicked to the side briefly and then back to her, as if he were deciding something. A flash of impatience passed over his face. "You don't need to show me anything, ma'am," he said, leaning closer. His breath was sharp, the edge of his words like a slap in the face. "I said, get out of the vehicle. Now." Layla felt the cold grip of fear clutch at her gut. This wasn't just a stop. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. She had heard stories, horrible, chilling stories of people in situations like hers who hadn't made it out alive, or who had been brutalized in the name of order. She could feel the tension in the air, the sense that everything was about to escalate. He wasn't just going to let her go. He wasn't going to back down. Her mind was racing. Her phone, it was still on the seat next to her. She could record this. She could make sure there was proof of what was happening, but she didn't have time to think it through completely. Suddenly, the officer reached for the door handle. He yanked it open with one quick motion, and before Layla could react, he was tugging at her arm, pulling her forward. The shock of it was enough to freeze her for a moment. Pain flared in her chest, the force of his grip bruising her skin. She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. "Stop!" Layla gasped, her voice tight with a mix of fear and disbelief. "You can't do this. I told you." But he didn't stop. The officer was lifting her out of her seat now, pulling her with surprising strength, yanking her toward the door. Layla's heart raced, and she felt panic rise in her throat. She couldn't fight him. She couldn't get away from him. "Let go of me," she shouted, trying to twist away, but her body was powerless against his strength. Her legs unable to hold her, her arms too weak to break his hold. Her prosthetics, already partially dislodged from the motion, were now completely twisted out of place, dangling loosely as he dragged her out. The clattering sound of the leg falling to the pavement was like a distant echo, but to Layla it felt like the world had broken open. She could feel the weight of her legs pulling her down, the stares of the people around them, the sharp edges of humiliation sinking in deeper with every second. "Stop it!" Layla screamed, her voice raw now, her breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. "Shut up!" the officer snapped, his grip tightening. His face was hard, devoid of any empathy, any understanding. His jaw clenched as he struggled to pull her out completely. For a moment, everything seemed to blur. The pain, the fear, the onlookers who had gathered, some with phones in their hands, others too shocked to move. The world felt far away, like Layla was trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape. The officer's hands were on her arms, pulling her forcibly from the car. She was losing control, the very ground beneath her slipping away as he dragged her into the street. Someone shouted from the crowd, another voice joining the chaos. "Stop! What are you doing to her?" a man called out, rushing forward. "She can't walk. You can't just drag her out like that." But the officer didn't care. He was relentless, his eyes narrowed with authority, as though Layla's resistance was an affront to him. The crowd murmured, some shouting, some filming, but it didn't seem to matter. The officer was determined to carry out his orders, no matter what. "Move along, people," he barked at the witnesses, but his words had no power to silence the outrage that was building. Layla's mind was still spinning, the adrenaline flooding her system. She wasn't helpless. She wasn't going to let this man break her. She forced herself to think. Her phone was still recording. She had to get it to someone, anyone who could help. She had to make sure there was a record of this. She could see the crowd now. People were taking out their phones. This wasn't just happening to her anymore. This was happening in front of others, and they were watching, recording. Someone would hear. Someone would do something. "Here!" Layla managed to choke out, her voice hoarse as she reached toward the closest person, a woman standing near the sidewalk, her phone in hand. "Please, take my phone. Keep recording." The woman looked stunned, but she nodded quickly, stepping forward to grab the phone from Layla's hand. The officer barely seemed to notice, his focus entirely on dragging Layla further away from the car. "Get off me!" Layla screamed again, the sound tearing through her throat. She could feel her body begin to go limp, the pain and fear too much to bear. But then, through the haze of panic, a sudden flash of clarity hit her. The camera. The people watching. The evidence was in motion, and there was no way this could go unnoticed. The officer was still pulling her. But Layla wasn't alone anymore. The officer's grip on her arm felt like a vice, each tug and pull sending shock waves of pain through Layla's body. Her prosthetic legs, twisted and precariously dangling, clattered noisily against the pavement as he dragged her further from the car. The crowd had gathered now, some murmuring in disbelief, others shouting protests. But it was all a blur. Layla's focus narrowed to the officer's harsh grip and the panic rising in her chest, threatening to consume her. In the distance, she could hear sirens wailing, but the sound was distant, as though it belonged to another world. The officer had not yet released his hold. His expression remained stone cold, his eyes focused on her with an unsettling intensity, as if he were daring her to fight back, daring her to do something. But all Layla could do was feel the scrape of the asphalt under her, the weakness of her body unable to push back against his force. "Let me go," Layla finally managed to say, her voice shaky but firm, desperation creeping in. "You're hurting me. I can't walk. I can't." "You're not above the law, lady," the officer sneered, tightening his grip. His words were like a slap. "You think, just because you're disabled, I'm going to let you get away with this? You're just another troublemaker, playing the victim. I'm doing my job, so you better stop complaining." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Another troublemaker. That was how he saw her. Not a person, not someone who had fought through impossible odds to get to where she was. To him, she was just someone trying to make excuses, someone who deserved to be punished, as though her disability was an offense in itself. Her hands clenched into fists, but there was no way to fight back physically. What was the point of resisting when the system already had its mind made up about you? The crowd around them had started to grow, and Layla could see a mix of confusion, fear, and anger in their eyes. Some were still filming, their cameras capturing every second, while others were shouting at the officer, calling for him to let her go. But none of it seemed to make a difference. The officer wasn't listening. His eyes were locked on her, as though he had decided that she was a problem that needed solving. The woman who had taken Layla's phone was still standing by, her face pale with disbelief, but she kept the phone trained on the scene, the lens capturing the whole encounter. Layla's eyes locked onto her for a split second, and she gave a subtle nod, silently urging the woman to keep recording. "You're making a mistake," Layla said through gritted teeth, her body trembling with both the strain of being dragged and the fear that gripped her. "I'm not resisting. I'm not doing anything wrong." "Shut up," the officer barked, pushing her roughly against the side of his patrol car. "You think I don't know what you're doing? This is just another one of your pity parties. You think you're special because you've got a disability? You don't get a pass for that." Layla's chest tightened as he shoved her, the pain shooting up her spine. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the space around them, and everything in her world, everything that had been steady and grounded, seemed to tilt. Why was he doing this? Why was he so angry? "Just stop," she whispered, her breath shallow. "I didn't do anything wrong. I just wanted to go home." But the officer wasn't listening. His hand reached for his radio, and in the stillness of the street, Layla could hear him speak into the mic, his voice cold, steady. "Dispatch, I need backup. I have a situation here and I need assistance. She's being uncooperative." The words sent a shock of fear through her. Backup? For what? What had she done that warranted more officers? "Uncooperative?" Layla repeated, her voice rising with disbelief. "I'm not uncooperative. You're the one." "Enough," the officer yelled, cutting her off. He took a step back, surveying her for a moment, his eyes narrowing. "You think just because I'm not letting you off easy, I'm the problem here? You don't know what it's like to do this job, to put up with people like you every damn day." Layla's heart hammered in her chest, a surge of anger mixing with the fear. People like me? What does that mean? Exactly what you think it means, the officer spat, his words laced with venom. You disabled people think the world owes you something. You expect everyone to tiptoe around you, make special accommodations. But guess what? The world doesn't work that way. You're just one more person trying to play the victim card. His words stung, cutting deep into a place Layla had tried to protect. She had faced prejudice before. Every person with a disability had. But this felt like something different. It was not just his words, but his entire demeanor. How he stood over her, how he looked down at her as if she were less than human. It was all there, in every inflection of his voice, every shift of his body. She was just a person to be tolerated, not someone deserving of respect. And suddenly, Layla realized with a sickening clarity, this wasn't just about her. This was about everyone like her. The officer was making a statement, not just to her, but to everyone who had ever been marginalized, ignored, or looked down upon. He had decided, in this moment, that her disability meant she was less, that she was nothing more than a nuisance, a target. The adrenaline was starting to take over her body, pushing her fear to the back of her mind as the anger began to rise. She wasn't going to let him do this to her, not today. She wasn't going to let him get away with it. Do you have any idea what it's like? Layla finally shot back, her voice rising, her eyes flashing with a fire that surprised even her. Do you have any idea what it's like to fight every day, just to be seen as human? To have people look at you like you're something less? You don't get to make me the problem here. You don't get to take my dignity. The officer stared at her for a moment, his expression unreadable, but something flickered in his eyes, something darker, something that told her that he was not prepared for her response. For a moment, he faltered. His hand hovered near his gun again, but his eyes never left her. That was when the backup arrived. 2 more police cars pulled up, tires screeching to a halt. The officers that stepped out were younger, their uniforms a little more disheveled. One of them, a tall, broad-shouldered man, walked up to the scene, glancing from Layla to the officer who had been manhandling her. The new officer looked uncertain, his gaze lingering on the phone recording the scene. "What's going on here?" the new officer asked, his voice a little more measured than the first one's. The officer who had been rough with Layla took a step back, his hands still clenched into fists. "She's uncooperative. I need her arrested." The tall officer raised an eyebrow, glancing down at Layla and then back at the first officer. "Uncooperative? What's she done?" "She's causing a disturbance," the first officer spat, still seething, "refusing to comply. She's making a scene." Layla's mind spun. Could this be happening? Was this really how it was going to play out? But the tall officer wasn't buying it. He looked at Layla, his gaze softening, then back at the first officer. "Let's take a step back," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You don't need to escalate this further. She's not causing trouble. She's just trying to go home." The tension in the air thickened as the younger officer looked at his colleague, the shift in power palpable. Layla felt the shift too, a sense of cautious hope rising in her chest. This wasn't over. She hadn't been broken, not yet. The weight of the tall officer's words settled over the scene like a quiet storm, changing the atmosphere almost instantly. The tension in the air, which had been so thick it felt suffocating, suddenly loosened, but it wasn't entirely gone. Layla's heart pounded in her chest, her breath still shallow and uneven. The officer who had been dragging her along looked enraged, his face flushed with a mix of anger and humiliation. But for the first time since the encounter began, Layla saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. The backup officer, taller, younger, and somehow less rigid in his demeanor, was now standing between them, his stance open but commanding. His arms were crossed, his gaze moving back and forth from Layla to the officer who had been so forceful. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step back," the younger officer said, his tone firm but not aggressive. He wasn't shouting, but there was a quiet authority in his voice that seemed to make the air around him shift. "We're not escalating this. You need to let her go." The first officer's jaw clenched at the demand, and for a moment the silence between them was oppressive. Layla's hands trembled slightly at her sides, her eyes flickering from one officer to the other, searching for any sign of movement. The crowd had grown, the murmur of voices around her now louder than ever. Phones continued to record the scene, and she could hear a few people whispering to each other, some offering support, others questioning the officer's actions. But the first officer didn't let go of his aggressive posture. He stood there, glaring at the new officer, eyes narrowed with barely concealed fury. "This is none of your business. I don't need you getting involved." His voice was low, tight, and the anger in it was unmistakable. "Actually, it is my business," the younger officer shot back. "We're all supposed to be doing our jobs, and that includes de-escalating situations, not making them worse. You need to stop. Now." Layla felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety. She didn't know what would happen next. The first officer was still standing too close to her, too angry, and part of her wondered if this was just a temporary shift. Was this officer going to back down, or was the fight just beginning? Her chest tightened with a fresh wave of dread. She had no idea how this would play out. "Back off, Derek," the first officer spat, finally turning to the younger man. His voice was thick with disdain. "You don't know what it's like. You don't get it. You haven't been out here long enough. You don't understand how people like her think they can get away with anything just because they have a disability. She's trying to manipulate you." The younger officer, Derek, took a deep breath and met the older officer's glare with calm. "I understand enough to know when things are being taken too far. She hasn't done anything wrong. You've overstepped." He stepped closer to the first officer, his posture still non-threatening but unyielding. Layla's mind raced as she absorbed the back and forth between them. She could feel her prosthetics slipping out of place, her body starting to ache from being pulled so roughly earlier. But the conversation between the officers was grounding her in the moment. It was a struggle, a clash of perspectives, a fight over power, control, and responsibility. But it was also a fight for her dignity, and in that, Layla found some measure of strength. Derek turned his head slowly toward Layla, his eyes softer now, though still filled with concern. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost tentative. Layla nodded, though the words she wanted to say caught in her throat. She wasn't okay, but she couldn't afford to let her fear take over. Not now. "I'm fine," she finally managed, her voice hoarse. I just want to go home." Derek nodded, his jaw tightening as he glanced back at the older officer. The older man's posture hadn't softened, but his expression had darkened with frustration. "I'm not done here," the first officer muttered under his breath, clearly unwilling to accept defeat. "She's resisting. She's making a scene. She needs to be arrested." Layla's eyes widened as the officer took another step toward her, but before he could say another word, Derek's voice rang out, loud and authoritative. "No, you're not arresting her. She has done nothing illegal. If you try to force this, I'll file a report on you, and I'll make sure it's reviewed. You're not walking away from this." The older officer looked like he was about to explode, his face reddening with rage. But Derek didn't flinch. He stood his ground, unwavering in his stance, his eyes locked on the first officer's, as if daring him to make the next move. It was clear now that this was more than just a power struggle. Derek wasn't just standing up for Layla. He was challenging the system, challenging the authority that the first officer had been wielding like a weapon. The first officer took another breath, his lips thinning, his fists clenched. It felt like an eternity before he spoke again, and when he did, his voice was low, almost menacing. "This isn't over," he said, his eyes narrowing at Derek, then flicking back to Layla, where they lingered for a moment longer than necessary. Without another word, he turned on his heel and stormed toward his patrol car, slamming the door behind him with a force that sent a small tremor through the street. Layla didn't dare breathe easy just yet. She knew that this moment of relief was temporary, that Officer's anger was far from gone. But for now, she had won a small victory. Derek took a step closer to her, his expression more open now, though still cautious. "Are you sure you're all right?" he asked again, his voice gentle. Layla glanced up at him, the rawness of her emotions suddenly hitting her all at once. She wanted to break down, to collapse into the street and let the weight of everything finally pull her under. But she couldn't do that. Not here. Not in front of all these people. "I'm okay," she said, though the words felt hollow. "But I'm not. I'm not okay with what just happened." Derek nodded, his gaze softening with understanding. "I know, and I'm sorry you had to go through that. I really am." The sirens that had been wailing in the distance had finally grown louder, and Layla turned her head towards the sound. She could see another squad car approaching from the intersection, but Derek held up a hand, signaling them to stop. "We're done here," Derek said to the new officers who had arrived, his tone final. "No need for anyone else. She's not pressing charges, and there's no reason for further action." The new officers hesitated for a moment before slowly pulling away, though their eyes remained fixed on Layla as they drove past. There was still a tension in the air, but it was beginning to break apart. The crowd, too, began to disperse, though a few people remained, some still recording, some offering silent nods of solidarity. "Thank you," Layla said quietly, her voice still shaky but sincere, "for stepping in." Derek smiled faintly, though there was sadness in his eyes. "It's my job, but you're welcome." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Layla could feel her body beginning to shake with the after effects of adrenaline, the realization of what had just transpired slowly sinking in. She was still in shock, still processing everything that had happened. But in that moment, she was free. She had survived. The officer who had tried to overpower her had left, and the crowd was thinning, but the damage had been done. This wasn't just a story about one officer's abuse of power. This was a reminder, one that Layla would carry with her, that the fight for dignity, for humanity, was far from over. It was a fight that had to be waged every day, by every person who had ever been told they were less than. And as Derek walked away, his steps heavy with the weight of everything unspoken, Layla knew that this moment wasn't just a fluke. This was something larger, something that, for better or worse, had changed everything. The weeks following the incident at the traffic stop were a blur of emotions for Layla. Her body still ached from the rough handling. Her mind replayed the confrontation over and over, each time with a different set of questions and unanswered frustrations. But it wasn't just the physical pain that lingered. It was the feeling of being violated, not just by the officer, but by a system that seemed designed to treat her as less than human, less than anyone else. As she sat in her apartment, the soft hum of the city filtering through her window, she couldn't help but reflect on everything that had transpired. The video had gone viral, the footage of her being dragged from her car spreading like wildfire across social media. People had shared it, commented on it, and in some cases defended her. There were others, though, who sided with the officer, making excuses for his behavior, even going so far as to blame Layla for escalating the situation. But it was the media response that was truly unsettling. The headline in the local newspaper had been a sharp reminder of just how deep the divisions ran. Disabled woman confronts officer in dispute over traffic stop. No mention of abuse, no mention of the officer's aggression. It was as if her disability had been the focal point, as if that alone was justification for the way she'd been treated. Layla clenched her jaw, scrolling through the comments on the article. Some of them made her sick to her stomach. Others were more balanced, but even those felt like they barely scratched the surface of the real issue. She wasn't just confronting an officer. She was fighting for her dignity, her rights, her humanity. But how could anyone understand that when the narrative was already written? The sound of a knock at her door startled her. It was late in the evening, and she hadn't been expecting anyone. Hesitantly, she made her way to the door, her hand hovering over the handle for a moment before she pulled it open. Standing on the other side was Derek, the officer who had stepped in during the confrontation. His uniform was slightly disheveled, and there was a look of concern on his face as he stepped into her view. "Layla," he said softly, his voice almost uncertain. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." Layla blinked, momentarily taken aback. She hadn't expected to see him again, especially not like this. "No, you're not interrupting anything," she replied, stepping aside to let him in. Derek walked in, his eyes scanning the apartment briefly before he looked back at her. He hesitated, clearly unsure how to proceed, before finally speaking again. "I wanted to check on you. After what happened, I know it's been a lot. I'm sorry for what you had to go through." Layla nodded, her chest tightening slightly. She hadn't expected an apology, especially not from a police officer. It wasn't like she had any real expectation of sympathy or understanding from anyone involved in the system. But Derek had seen something in her that the others had not. He had made the choice to intervene, to do what was right, even when it wasn't easy. And for that, she couldn't help but feel a mixture of gratitude and confusion. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet. "I didn't think anyone would step in, not like that." Derek's face softened, and he took a few steps further into the room. "I couldn't just let that happen. I know it's not much, but I'm trying to make things right. It wasn't right, what happened to you. It wasn't right at all." Layla looked at him, her heart heavy. She didn't know what she had expected from him. Perhaps nothing more than a fleeting gesture of decency. But there was something in his voice now, in the sincerity in his eyes, that made her think that maybe, just maybe, there were people who truly wanted change. "Why did you come here?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "You don't have to apologize. I don't want anyone to feel like they have to make up for what happened." Derek hesitated, running a hand through his hair, clearly struggling with his words. "I've been thinking about it," he said slowly, choosing each word carefully. "The thing is, I've seen a lot in this job. Too much, maybe. But that day, something about it didn't sit right with me. Not just the way he treated you, but the whole situation. I kept asking myself why I didn't do more sooner, why I didn't step in faster, and I guess I just wanted to say that I'm sorry for not doing more. Layla wasn't sure what to say. She hadn't expected this level of honesty. It was rare to encounter it, especially from someone who represented the very institution that had wronged her. She had always assumed that police officers were part of a machine that couldn't be changed, that they were just following orders, that most of them, no matter how well-intentioned, were just cogs in a larger, corrupt system. But Derek was different. "Thank you," she said again, her voice thick with emotion. "But you didn't have to do this. You didn't have to come here." Derek met her gaze, and for a moment the world seemed to still. There was a heaviness between them, a recognition of the injustice that had been done. Not just in that moment, but in a broader, societal sense. But there was also something else, something that neither of them had expected. A shared understanding, perhaps. A connection forged not by circumstance, but by a mutual desire for change. "I needed to," Derek replied softly. "I've seen too many things go wrong, too many moments where people didn't stand up when they should have. I couldn't walk away from that." Layla looked at him, her heart aching with something she couldn't quite place. It wasn't forgiveness. She wasn't sure she could forgive the system that had allowed her to be treated like that, or the officer who had started it all. But there was something in Derek's words, in his willingness to be vulnerable with her, that made her wonder if maybe there was hope. Not just for them, but for something larger. "Do you believe things can change?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly, the question hanging between them like a fragile thread. Derek didn't hesitate. "I want to believe it. I have to believe it." Layla nodded slowly, a sense of something deeper beginning to settle in her chest. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be more battles to fight, more injustices to face, more walls to break down. But in this moment, with Derek standing there, with a sense of quiet solidarity between them, she allowed herself a small measure of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the reckoning was beginning, not just for the officer who had abused his power, but for a system that had allowed that abuse to flourish. "Maybe," she said softly, "it starts with people like us. Standing up, speaking out, making sure that this doesn't happen again." Derek nodded, his eyes resolute. "Maybe." It had been months since the incident, and Layla found herself in a place she hadn't imagined. Her face had become familiar in the media. Images of her confrontation with the officer, the footage that had gone viral, the interviews she'd given. The world knew her name now, and, with it, they knew her story. But Layla hadn't chosen this. It wasn't a life she'd wanted or sought. She had been thrust into the spotlight, and now all she could do was make the best of it, to turn this traumatic event into something that might change the world. The court date was looming, a hearing that had been postponed twice due to delays, but it was finally happening. Layla had agreed to press charges, not because she wanted to, but because she knew it was necessary. It wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had faced injustice, about holding those who abused their power accountable. She wasn't fighting just for herself. She was fighting for the people who had been silenced, those who hadn't had the chance to tell their story. Her lawyer, Vanessa, was a formidable woman, a civil rights advocate who had taken on the case pro bono. Vanessa had been a beacon of hope for Layla, guiding her through the murky legal process, providing both legal and emotional support. The two had grown close, and Vanessa had made it clear that she saw something in Layla, something worth fighting for. The day of the hearing arrived, and Layla found herself standing outside the courthouse, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her blazer. The courthouse was imposing, its tall columns and stone facade almost intimidating. A small crowd had gathered, some journalists, some supporters holding signs that read, "Justice for Layla" and "End Police Brutality." It was surreal to see her name written on the signs, her struggle turned into a symbol of resistance. Derek was there too, standing off to the side, his uniform exchanged for a simple jacket and jeans. He caught her eye and gave her a small nod, his expression somber. He had agreed to testify on her behalf, to speak about what had happened that day. It was a risk for him. He knew it, and Layla knew it too. But he had insisted. He wanted to be part of the change, to stand up for what was right. Layla's heart pounded in her chest as she made her way up the courthouse steps, Vanessa walking beside her. Vanessa's hand found Layla's shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "You're going to do great, Layla. Just remember, you have every right to be here. You're fighting for the truth." Layla nodded, taking a deep breath. She knew Vanessa was right, but the fear was still there. The fear of speaking up, of standing in front of a room full of strangers, of facing the officer who had tried to strip her of her dignity. She had seen him in the courtroom earlier, his expression hard and unreadable, flanked by his lawyer, a man who had made it clear that he intended to defend his client's actions as being by the book. They entered the courtroom, the wooden benches filled with people, some spectators, others members of the press. Layla could feel the eyes on her as she made her way to the front, each step heavy with the weight of what she was about to do. She took her seat beside Vanessa, her fingers nervously tapping on the table in front of her. The officer, his name was Thomas Green, sat across the room, his eyes occasionally flickering toward Layla. He was clean-cut, his uniform replaced by a dark suit, his lawyer whispering something in his ear. Layla felt a chill run down her spine at the sight of him, the memories of that day flashing in her mind. She could still feel his hands on her, the roughness with which he had pulled her from the car, the disdain in his voice when he had spoken to her. But she wasn't going to let that fear control her. Not now, not anymore. The judge entered, and everyone stood as the hearing began. The opening statements were made, Vanessa's voice clear and powerful as she laid out the case, speaking about the abuse of power, the unnecessary use of force against a disabled person, the systemic issues that allowed such behavior to go unchecked. Layla listened, her heart swelling with a mixture of fear and pride. Vanessa was fighting for her, for all of them. The opposing lawyer spoke next, painting a picture of an officer simply doing his duty, a woman who had been uncooperative and hostile. Layla clenched her jaw as she listened, the words cutting into her like a knife. She could feel the anger rising within her, the sense of injustice that had been simmering for months now, threatening to boil over. But she kept her composure. She had to. When it was finally her turn to speak, Layla took a deep breath and wheeled herself to the witness stand. She could feel her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the microphone, her eyes flickering over the faces in the room, the judge, the jury, Vanessa, Derek, the people who had come to support her. And then her eyes met Officer Green's. He was staring at her, his expression cold, his eyes narrowing slightly as if daring her to speak. Layla cleared her throat, her voice shaky at first. "My name is Layla Thompson," she began, her eyes locked on the judge. "I'm here today because I believe that what happened to me was wrong. I was stopped by Officer Green for no reason. I was treated with cruelty, with disrespect, and I was denied my basic rights. I wasn't resisting. I wasn't a threat. I was simply trying to explain that I couldn't comply with his orders because of my disability." She paused, her voice growing stronger as she continued. "That day, I felt powerless. I felt like I was nothing more than an inconvenience, something to be dealt with, to be removed. But I'm not powerless, and I refuse to be silenced. What happened to me shouldn't happen to anyone else. No one should be made to feel like they are less than human, like their voice doesn't matter." Layla could feel the emotion rising in her throat, her eyes beginning to sting with unshed tears. She glanced at Vanessa, who gave her a small, encouraging nod. Layla took another breath, her gaze returning to the judge. "I'm not here to seek revenge," she said, her voice steady. "I'm here because I want change. I want accountability. I want a system that protects people, not one that makes them afraid. I want to be able to trust the people who are supposed to protect us." She could see Derek out of the corner of her eye, his expression pained, but there was a glimmer of hope there, too. He had been part of that system, and he was trying to change it from the inside. It wasn't an easy task, it was dangerous even, but he was willing to do it. And that gave Layla hope. When it was Derek's turn to testify, Layla listened as he spoke about what he had witnessed that day. He spoke about how Officer Green's behavior had been inappropriate, how he had overstepped, how Layla had not been resisting. His voice was calm, measured, but there was a passion there that Layla hadn't heard before. Derek was speaking not just as a witness, but as someone who believed in justice, who believed that the system could be better. The cross-examination was grueling. The opposing lawyer trying to discredit Layla's account, trying to paint her as uncooperative, as someone who had escalated the situation. But Layla held her ground. She spoke her truth, refusing to let herself be intimidated. She could feel the support of Vanessa beside her, of Derek, of the people who had come to see her fight for justice. When the hearing finally ended, Layla felt exhausted, every muscle in her body aching from the tension of the day. The judge had not yet made a decision, that would come later, but Layla knew that she had done everything she could. She had spoken her truth, she had fought for herself and for others like her. And that, in itself, was a victory. As she left the courtroom, Derek caught up with her, his face a mixture of exhaustion and hope. He walked beside her, his steps slow, his hands in his pockets. "You did great today, Layla," he said, his voice soft. "No matter what happens, you made a difference." Layla looked at him, her heart swelling with emotion. She nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Thank you for being there, for standing up for me." Derek smiled, his eyes meeting hers. "It's the least I could do. This fight isn't over, but we're in it together." Layla nodded again, the weight of his words settling over her. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. There would be more battles to face, more obstacles to overcome, but for the first time in a long time, Layla felt a sense of hope. She wasn't alone in this fight, and maybe, just maybe, things could change. As they stepped out into the sunlight, Layla looked at the crowd gathered outside, people cheering, holding signs, their faces filled with hope. She took a deep breath, letting the warmth of the sun wash over her. The road ahead was long, but she was ready to walk it. For herself, for those who couldn't, for those who would come after her. She was ready to fight. and she knew she wouldn't be fighting alone. It had been 6 months since that day in court, and Layla's life had slowly but surely begun to settle back into a new kind of normal. Everything that had happened over the past months had changed her forever. She felt as though she had walked through fire and emerged transformed, no longer the person who was full of fear and uncertainty, but someone who now knew the strength she possessed. The morning began with the sun's rays filtering through her curtains, casting a soft golden light across her bedroom. Layla lay in bed, staring at the sunlight, a gentle smile tugging at her lips. Today, there was no anxiety, no tension, only peace and quiet. She knew there would still be challenges ahead, but today was entirely hers. With these thoughts, Layla rose, carefully attaching her prosthetics before slowly making her way to the kitchen. Today, she was going to meet her friends, the same group who had supported her even before all the chaos. They had planned a picnic in the park, and Layla had promised to bring homemade cookies. In the kitchen, she gathered the ingredients, feeling the familiar rhythm of cooking take over. She mixed, stirred, and shaped the dough, her hands steady as she worked. As the cookies baked, the sweet aroma filled her small apartment, bringing with it a sense of warmth and comfort. These simple moments of normalcy had become even more precious to her. They were reminders that, despite everything, she still had the power to carve out joy in her life. Once the cookies were ready, Layla packed them up in a small basket, glancing at the clock. It was almost time to leave. She looked around her apartment, a place that had become her refuge, her sanctuary through all the ups and downs. Today, however, it wasn't just a place to retreat to. It was a starting point, a place from which she would venture out into a world that now felt different. As Layla drove to the park, the familiar streets passing by, she felt a sense of gratitude. She had learned so much, not only about herself, but also about the world around her. There were still injustices, still a system that needed changing, but she also knew she wasn't alone in this fight. She thought of Vanessa, her lawyer, whose fierce determination had helped her find her voice. She thought of Derek, the officer who had risked his career to stand up for what was right. And she thought of the countless strangers who had sent her messages of support, who had joined her in calling for change. When she arrived at the park, she saw her friends gathered under a large oak tree, a colorful blanket spread out on the grass. They waved when they saw her, their smiles wide and genuine. Layla felt her heart swell with warmth as she wheeled herself over to them, her basket balanced on her lap. "Hey, there she is," Jessica called out, getting up to help Layla with the basket. "We've been waiting for those cookies." Layla laughed, handing her the basket. "I hope they're worth the wait," she said, settling herself on the blanket. The air was warm, and the breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers. It was the perfect day for a picnic. The conversation flowed easily, filled with laughter and stories. Her friends talked about their lives, their work, their families, and when they asked Layla how she was doing, she spoke honestly about the challenges she still faced, about the moments of fear and doubt, but also about the strength she had found in herself. She talked about her plans to continue advocating for change, to use her voice to speak out against injustice. "I'm thinking of starting a support group," Layla said, her eyes shining with determination. "For people who have gone through similar experiences, people who need a place to feel heard and understood." Her friends nodded, their eyes filled with admiration. "That's amazing, Layla," one of them said. "You're going to help so many people." Layla smiled, feeling a sense of purpose settle into her chest. It wasn't about the past anymore. It was about what she could do now, how she could make a difference for others. She had been through something traumatic, something that could have broken her, but instead it had shown her just how strong she truly was. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the park, Layla looked around at her friends, the people who had stood by her side, who had helped her find her way back to herself. She knew the road ahead would still have its challenges, but she was ready for them. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living, fully and unapologetically. Layla took a deep breath, the scent of grass and flowers filling her senses, and smiled. This was her new beginning. And, for the first time in a long time, she felt truly hopeful. Thank you for watching. If you found this story meaningful, please consider subscribing to the channel for more powerful narratives. Don't forget to share this video to spread the message and check out other videos on the channel. You'll find more stories that challenge perspectives and inspire. Your support means everything.